Hello everyone, welcome back to our series of lectures on scale development. We are in part 4 of scale development, and for today I'm going to talk about the different types of response set or response format. So in part 1 we talked about an introduction to scale development. We talked about hypothetical constructs, why they are important, how to measure them. In part 2, we talked about important characteristics of a good scale, particularly validity and reliability. In part 3, I talked about some suggestions and tips on writing items. So if you are interested in those topics, you may find those videos in the channel, particularly in the playlist that I created entitled Scale Development. And so for today, like what I said, we'll talk about response format. Before we continue, I'm inviting everyone to please subscribe to my channel. More than 90% of the people who are watching these videos and lectures are not subscribed, so I would really appreciate it if you can support me and help my channel grow by subscribing. Thank you very much. Let's proceed to our topic for today. So when we say determining the format for the measurement or the response set, you're quite familiar with this. For those of you who have already taken scales or tests, you know that oftentimes the items include a stem, like a declarative statement describing a particular individual, and then you are made to choose on whether you agree or disagree. Sometimes there is a set of 4 or 5 or 6 response options on whether you agree or disagree with the stem statement, with the declarative statement. Those options are what we refer to as the response set. You have different options for what kind of response set that you want to use in the scale that you are developing. The response set is very important, and you do not decide on what response set you're gonna make independent of the items that you write. No? In fact, when you generate the items, you should already know what kind of response set you're gonna use, because sometimes specific items are only compatible with some types of response set, and vis-a-vis some types of response set are compatible only with a specific way of phrasing a particular item. So again, when you generate the items, it's quite important that you already know what the response set is gonna be. Now, there are many types of response set. In fact, there are 2 that I'm gonna show you later, which is not compatible with the scaling theory that I have discussed previously. So I'll just mention them, but will not discuss them thoroughly. So the theoretical model of scale development that I presented a while ago is only compatible with some specific response formats. And what is that theoretical model? That theoretical model suggests that scales are made up of items that are considered as indicators of the latent construct. These items are scorable on some kind of continuum, a continuum of possible responses. Each option in the continuum has some kind of numerical value or numerical counterpart. These numerical ratings are summed up or averaged, and that sum or average will serve as the composite score, which is theoretically an estimate of the true score of the latent construct that is within the individual. So the 2 types of response set that I'm not going to discuss but is simply going to mention for today is, the first one is Thurstone scaling. So here's an example of Thurstone scaling without having to elaborate it. So it's basically a series of sentences, and each of these sentences is describing some kind of gradation pertaining to a particular construct, and the individual is basically asked to respond whether they agree to each of these increasing level of the latent construct. And then the other one is Gutmann scaling, which is a series of questions, again, kind of increasing. For example, do you smoke? Do you smoke 10 cigarettes a day? Do you smoke more than a pack a day? So forth and so on. And the respondents simply check up to a certain point, and let's say, for example, I only smoke more than 10 cigarettes a day but not more than a pack a day, then I would agree on, do you smoke? I would say yes. Do you smoke more than 10 cigarettes a day? I'd say yes to that as well. Do you smoke more than a pack a day? I'd say no. So that would be my level of smoking. So that is Gutman scaling. But again, I'm just mentioning these because those are not really compatible with the scaling theory that I have discussed in the previous lectures. What I'm going to discuss and focus for today are what we refer to as scales with equally weighted items. So in this case, items are considered as more or less equivalent detectors of the construct. Each item is some sort of an imperfect indicator of a construct, and the rating to each indicator can be combined into a simple summation or averaging, and that sum or average is regarded as a score that represents the true score of the hypothetical construct that is within the individual. In most cases, each item in the scale consists of two parts. The first part is the stem, and that would refer to the declarative statement here. For example, exercise is an essential component of a healthy lifestyle. And then a series of response options, in this case ranging from 1, meaning to say strongly disagree, to 6, strongly agree. The stem of each item can be different declarative statements expressing an opinion or description. So perhaps this particular item, exercise is an essential component of a healthy lifestyle, is an indicator of a particular hypothetical construct. Let's say, for example, an opinion or perception with regard to exercise. Perhaps there are many other possible ways of phrasing this, or there are many possible indicators of that said hypothetical construct. So those other indicators would also be considered as part of the items in the scale. And then the response options, as I have said, accompanies each of these declarative sentence, and the response options may, for example, indicate agreement, such as the example here, or it could also measure frequency. For example, not at all to almost always. We have many options with regard to the number of response categories. So one question when deciding what kind of response format are we going to use is, what is the optimum number of response categories? Some response formats allow the subject for an infinite or a very large number of options. For example, scales like the scale of a thermometer or a response option from 1 to 100 provides a wide possibility of response categories. In fact, there are some response formats wherein you only have a line, and the one who's taking the test is instructed to indicate the response by jotting on the line to indicate or to express his or her opinion or self-reporting within that particular continuum. However, there are response sets that are quite limited. For example, there are response sets that are limited to 4 only, are typical 4-point scales. And more than that, there are also even binary options, meaning to say that the response set is just 2, either yes or no, agree or disagree, always, never. One thing that you can consider in deciding the optimum number of response categories would be your consideration for variability. An important thing that we should have in mind when developing a scale is that we should be able to capture variability. And there are 2 ways by which we can increase variability. One is to have a lot of scale items. So if, let's say, for example, you have 50 items, then that would introduce a lot of variability. Or one way of introducing variability is also to increase the response options. So having a 4-point scale introduces limited variability. There's much less variability if the options is binary, but there is more variability when you have an infinite number of options or a response set that can be 1 to 100. So considering those, you might want to play a little bit of a trade-off here, in a way that if your scale has few items, then many gradations of responses can be useful in order to ensure that there will be variability in the measure. However, if you have many items, then having a more restricted response set is also okay. I guess another thing that you should also consider is the nature of the variable. No? There are some variables that I think are best represented by a binary type of response, and then there are some variables that are best captured with a wider set of response categories. However, note that too many items can bore the respondent and lower the reliability of the responses. So that's something that you have to think about. Don't want to scale with too many items because that can tire your participants, your respondents. Another thing to consider is that having too much response options can affect the respondent's ability to discriminate meaningfully. Sometimes, if there are many options, it's quite difficult to meaningfully discriminate one response from another. So it says here, the respondent's ability to discriminate meaningfully between the response options depend on the specific wording or the physical placement of the options. For example, here, so we have options here, many, some, few, very few, none. Personally, I think participants will have no problem discriminating many from some or many from few, or few and very few. I think participants clearly know that very few is fewer than few and none is even less than very few. What I think participants might have some kind of confusion here or have a lesser ability to discriminate is the ability to distinguish some from few. Like, which is more? Is some more than few? Is few more than some? But what helps here in this case is the arrangement of the options. So if I am a participant and I have here many, on the other side I can see none, then I know that few is less than some based on the way that these words are arranged. So that arrangement is very helpful and is something that you should consider, as opposed to presenting your options in this way. So this kind of word arrangement or arrangement of options is not very helpful. It's quite confusing. It would be much better if you present it in some kind of a linear fashion, because our brain easily recognizes lines. So based on my personal experience, I think that one, you shouldn't have too many items, and because of that, you might want to introduce some kind of variability, if possible, in the response set, but also not too many categories. So I'd say probably if having 6 or 7 or 5 options is possible and it's still meaningful, and that you know that participants can meaningfully discriminate among those 5, 6, 7 options, I think that would be ideal. Another question is the question of whether to have odd or even number response categories. Having 5 categories in a response set is quite different from having 6 categories in a response set, 5 being odd and 6 being even. So when do we use an odd number of responses versus an even number of responses? So it says here, if the response options are bipolar, with one extreme indicating an opposite of the other, for example, a strong positive versus a strong negative attitude, an odd number permits equivocation, or an option to neither agree or disagree, or a response that indicates uncertainty or non-commitment. So if you think that the particular variable that you're measuring has an actual middle ground, it's quite possible for a person to neither agree or disagree. It's logical for a person to have a neutral position with regard to that particular construct. Then having an odd number response set or response categories would be meaningful. But again, think about it. Is it logical, or is it possible for an individual to be neutral with regard to the construct that you are measuring? So that's the ideal situation wherein we use an odd number response set. An even number response set forces respondents to make at least a weak commitment in the direction of one or the other extreme. So essentially, you're forcing the individual to mildly agree or mildly disagree on a particular matter or with regard to the construct that you are measuring. And when is this ideal? Again, you have to think about the construct. No? Is this particular construct something that one should have a position about? No? Either they agree or disagree, or at least mildly agree or mildly disagree. Is it not logical for an individual to be neutral about this? Then that situation, I guess, is where having an even number response set can be beneficial. There are some cultures that are kind of avoidant in making choices, and so having a middle option sometimes becomes a convenient way out, for not expressing a particular opinion. So if you want to preclude that, if you want to force people to have a particular opinion or at least express some kind of leaning, then having an even number response set would be better. No? They say that Filipinos tend to be like that, because Filipinos culturally are non-confrontational. They have a tendency to play it safe. And typically, when you give them scales, Filipinos tend to choose the middle option as a way of kind of avoiding the matter or being non-committal. So if you want to avoid that, because if most people think that way, then that would eliminate variability, which is what exactly you're trying to measure. So if you want to avoid that, then maybe having an even number response set would be better. So what are specific types of response set? So the first one is the ever popular Likert scales. So Likert scales are basically a set of declarative sentences, declarative statements followed by response options that indicate varying degrees of agreement with or endorsement of that particular statement. The response options should be worded as to have roughly equal intervals with respect to agreement. So take note of that phrasing, roughly equal intervals. A common practice is to include 6 possible responses ranging from strongly disagree, moderately disagree, mildly agree, moderately agree, and strongly agree. If you want, you can also add a midpoint, making it 7 response options instead of 6. Likert scales are typically used in instruments that measure opinions, beliefs, and attitudes. It is often useful for these statements to be fairly strong, but not extremely strong. This one is an example of a fairly strong statement. physicians generally ignore what patients say, as opposed to once in a while, physicians might forget or miss something a patient have told them. And this is something that you have to also remember in writing the items. Typically, the items have to be fairly strong, but not extremely strong. What would be an extremely strong statement? Something like all physicians ignore what patients say all the time. So I think that's rather an extremely strong statement. Another thing that you have to consider when writing the items is that there are some items that people generally agree with, and so you wouldn't want to make use of these items. For example, the statement, the safety and security of citizens are important. Most people would strongly agree with this, which means to say that this particular item will not yield variability. So you want to avoid items such as this. No? So you want to use STEM items which you know some people would agree and some people would disagree. No? You want to use STEM items that can capture the variability in the construct that you are measuring. So here are examples of Likert scales. So this is the example that we gave a while ago. Exercise is an essential component of a healthy lifestyle. So that is the STEM. And then we have a range of options here. Another example is combating drug abuse should be a top national priority. And then there are 5 options. So there's a middle option. So the options are completely true, mostly true, equally true and untrue, mostly untrue, and completely untrue. Now take note that these 2 items are measuring different constructs. You might think that it's okay within the scale to have multiple items that have different response sets. Some have 6 response categories, some have 5 response categories. Ideally, you would want to use the same response set for all of your items to avoid confusion. So these are just examples. Don't think of these as items belonging in the same scale. The next kind of response set is semantic differential scale. So as the term suggests, semantic referring to word meanings and then differential. So as you can see, here's an example. So I would assume that the instruction here is for the participants to think about a specific individual, in this case an automobile salesperson, and to indicate whether the respondent thinks that an automobile salesperson is honest or dishonest, quiet or noisy. And the instruction is basically among these options here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Where do you think a salesperson is? Is a salesperson leaning towards more dishonest, or do you think more honest? Do you think a salesperson is more noisy or more quiet? So if I am to rate this, I'd probably choose the middle ground. I wouldn't say that an automobile salesperson is either automatically honest or more dishonest. I think that's more of a characteristic of the individual. Between quiet and noisy, I'd probably lean towards more noisy, considering that part of the skill of a good salesperson is to talk and to convince people. So probably leaning towards this side. So this is an example of a semantic differential scale. It's mainly used in attitude research. So essentially in here, you're measuring your attitude towards a salesperson. Do you like or do you have a positive opinion or a negative opinion of an automobile salesperson? The semantic differential scale can be used in reference to one or more stimuli. So I can make use of the same set of options and polarities on another individual, for example, a teacher. Each pair represents the opposite ends of a continuum. So that is something that you have to pay attention to. So make sure that the words here represent the opposite ends of a continuum. So the individual lines that we're seeing here, 7 or 9, are common numbers that represent the points along the continuum. And the task of the respondent is to place a mark on one of the lines to indicate the point along the continuum that he thinks characterizes the stimulus. The adjective that one chooses can either be bipolar or unipolar. When we say bipolar, the adjectives express the presence of the opposite attribute. For example, friendly and hostile are opposite ends of the continuum. A unipolar adjective pairs indicate the presence or absence of a single attribute. For example, friendly and not friendly. So, not friendly is not necessarily the direct opposite of being friendly. Not friendly is just merely the absence of friendliness. So, that is a unipolar adjective pair. You could have a set of adjective pairs, a set of items that you think are good indicators of the same hypothetical construct. For example, using the following pairs, trustworthy, untrustworthy, fair, unfair, truthful, untruthful, can all be hypothetical indicators of a construct. Let's say, for example, honesty. So, an argument can be made that honesty as a general construct can be measured by these adjective pairs. The score in the individual honesty items could be added up and considered as a score that represents the true score of the individual when it comes to perception of honesty. Another type of scale would be the visual analog. It's quite similar to semantic differential scale. And here we present the respondents with a continuous line between a pair of descriptors representing the opposite ends of a continuum. The individual is instructed to place a mark at a point on the line that represents his or her own opinion, experience, belief, or whatever is being measured. And here is an example of a visual analog. So this one, as you can see, it's a line, presents even more response options. So let's say, for example, I'm being asked to rate what I feel about my knee, and the options is ranging from no pain at all to worst pain I've ever experienced. So I would indicate here what I think the pain level I'm experiencing in my knee. And how will you measure this? What's the point system? It depends. Sometimes they measure this by millimeter, sometimes by centimeter. So that depends on the scoring standard for that particular scale. Potentially, this can be very sensitive. You're measuring by millimeter after all. One problem here is that people may have different interpretations of physical spaces as it relates to the values on the continuum. So the matter of distinguishing one point of the space to another, that can be quite problematic. And then another problem with this kind of scale is that considering the specific options here, different people might have experienced different levels of worst pain. And so if we're experiencing the same pain, I might rate it here because I've experienced worse pain than you, and you might rate the same level of pain somewhere here because historically you haven't experienced as much pain as I have had. So the ratings can be subjective, is basically what we're trying to say. The visual analog is often used in single item measures, and because of that, it's impossible to determine internal consistency or inter-item reliability. The next one is the numerical response formats. So again, it's quite similar to the visual analog. We have a pair here of phrases, almost never, almost always, that represents the ends of a continuum. And basically between almost never and almost always, you have an array of numerals, and the respondents is basically instructed to choose which among 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, which among these numbers along the continuum represent how frequent or infrequent have they done or thought about a particular thought or have done a particular behavior. This is a very good kind of response set because they say that this corresponds to how we process numerical information. Numbers arrayed in a sequence express quantity not only in their numerical value but also in their location. The visual line of numbers is not merely a convenient representation but also corresponds to fundamental neural processes. So they say that numerical response formats is also a very good option as a response set. And finally, we also have binary options. In a binary option, the subject might be asked to check off all adjectives on a list that they think might apply to themselves, and the options are basically yes or no. So they only have two options. Yes, this applies to me. No, this does not apply to me. Of course, yes or no could also have numerical counterparts. The scale could indicate that yes should be given a point of 1 and no should be given a point of 0, and then that can be summed up, and then you have a score also that represents the true score of the hypothetical construct that is being measured. So responses reflecting items sharing a common latent variable, adjectives such as sad and happy, blue, could represent the underlying Latin variable, which is depressive feelings, can be combined into a single score for that particular construct. Of course, the obvious shortcoming of the binary response set is that each item has minimal variability. Lastly, when you are preparing your scale in the response format, and also when you're preparing the instructions, another thing that you have to consider is the time element, or the item time frames. A scale may be in a format that asks respondents to indicate how often during the past week they have experienced varied mood states. So sometimes in the instruction, sometimes you can specify the time period which the participant or the respondent should evaluate. If you're measuring constructs like traits, normally this does not require a specific time frame. But let's say, for example, in one of the scales that I tried to develop, a motivational problem scale, I had to specify the time frame. So I asked them to think about the last 2 weeks of studying, and within the last 2 weeks of studying, what kind of motivational problems they have encountered. So I think there are some constructs that are more sensitive, and you have to specify a specific time frame so that each and every one of the respondents are thinking of the same thing. So this would be for constructs that are more transient, not very stable, changes from one period to another. We know, for example, that motivational problems are not constant. Sometimes we have less motivational problems. Sometimes we have more motivational problems. Same thing with mood. Sometimes we're in a good mood. Sometimes we're in a bad mood. So I think in measuring mood specifically, you have to specify the time frame for which the participant should have in mind in answering the questions. And theory will be a very important source of information with regard to the time frame. So essentially, you're asking yourself, is the phenomenon of interest fundamental? If it's fundamental, then it might not require to think about a specific time frame. But if it's changing, then we have to introduce that particular dimension, particularly when you lay down the instructions to the respondents. Sometimes you also need to specify in the instruction what the student should be referring to or thinking about when they answer the items. So, for example, you're mentioning a specific type of self-efficacy in taking a test, then you have to specify in the instructions that the students have to think about their experiences before or during test-taking situations. And then, of course, the items would measure whether or not they are efficacious or they have self-belief that they will successfully take the test. Sometimes, if the items are family related, then probably you have to specify that when they answer the items, they have to think about their most recent experience at home. So that is something that you have to consider also in preparing your scale. So that's it for today. I hope that you learned something about the different types of response set. So again, this is part 4. In the coming days, I will also be talking about part 5, which is about content validation or the item review of experts, and also pilot testing. So thank you for sticking around. Again, if you learned something, I would appreciate it if you can subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.